2 days ago, Apple held their highly anticipated event, the Worldwide Developer Conference. This is where they show off all the new features and all the new software they're creating. And this one was especially important because it was Apple's introduction into AI, the buzzword we've learned to love over the past year. Now, Apple took this approach of the Apple way of doing AI, which means rebranding it to Apple Intelligence and focusing on personalization, customization, how the AI actually contacts the customer, and importantly, privacy. Now, when I watched this presentation, I did an entire recap of it. I was actually impressed by it. And I don't think I'm super easily impressed. I genuinely thought the presentation was good. So Apple addressed major concerns both for investors in artificial intelligence and incentivizing future growth and defending themselves against onerous regulation. They did that all in a single presentation. Like always, during the presentation, the stock traded down. And I pointed out during this that that's typically what happens. People are watching the presentation and there's so much information to take in that you're almost a little bit nervous of what it all means. But when investors decided to sleep on it and give it a night, it was like they had time to wake up and realize that Apple's going to be okay, that their new method of going into AI is probably going to be successful. And the stock has been like a rocket ever since. The day after the presentation, Apple ended the day 7% in the green. Now that's almost $200 billion in market cap for a company like Apple. They quickly regained the top position from Microsoft as the largest company in the world. And now we move on to day 2 after this same presentation, and it's up another 6%. These are incredible gains for a company this size. Back-to-back high single-digit gain days. You don't see that often with a company like Apple. So investors really had time to kind of boil down and digest the different news in this developer conference, and it seems like they like it. They're buying more and more into Apple's strategy. Now, one person that has been covering Apple for a long period of time from a consumer perspective, from a reviewer perspective, is Marques Brownlee, or MKBHD. You probably know him because he has an incredibly widely popular tech review channel. I think he's the most popular in the world at this point. So he went to the event and he also got the chance to sit down with Tim Cook. He sat down with Tim Cook for around 15 minutes and asked him about this specific event, about Apple Intelligence, how it's different than AI. He asked him about privacy, the handoff to OpenAI and the partnership with OpenAI, and a lot of different subjects. So we're going to go through this interview. I want to kind of translate what's going on here and what I believe Tim Cook is doing from an investment perspective. So this interview is more from a consumer perspective, from a tech reviewer perspective, but I want to give you my thoughts as an investor in Apple. So we have a lot to get to. If you like this type of content, you can consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. Now let's go ahead and start off with this interview. This is Marques Brownlee and Tim Cook.
Which was really fun to watch. It was a whole 2 hours. I want to zoom all the way out because obviously a lot of talk about AI in general. And I'm kind of just left wondering how Apple defines AI in general. Because I know if you ask a regular person, you might hear about generative AI, chatbots, things like that. And these are relatively new additions to Apple's AI portfolio. How do you look at AI as Apple?
Well, we've been executing with AI for a long time. It's at you're wearing a watch. It's at the root of the watch. I mean, you think about things like crash detection, fall detection, things like AFib, and all of this kind of stuff is machine learning at the end of the day. And so, but what has captured people's imagination is generative AI. And we see it as the opportunity for a whole new curve of technology and providing and doing more things for people, providing an assistant for people, things that really improve people's lives.
His answer here is so good, and it's so Apple. This is the most Apple answer you can have. Apple doesn't look at things the same way most other companies look at things. If you go to NVIDIA, if you go to Google, if you go to, even Android, in a lot of cases, they've advertised their products as having this much storage and this many nits of brightness in their phones and this type of processor. And here's the name of the processor, right? It's all the technical specs of the device. And although some people can be impressed by technical specs, that's not the way that Apple tries to communicate with their customers. Apple just says, this device is going to be better than the last one. It's going to be a lot better. It's going to be double as bright. It's going to be smoother. It'll be more fun to use. You're going to love this new device. So it's a difference in communication. Apple doesn't focus their branding on whatever the latest tech is. They focus the branding on how the tech communicates with the customer. So instead of it being artificial intelligence or machine learning, it's just that you have fall detection in your watch, or you have AFib technology. Those are all things the watch does that helps the consumer, because the consumer can understand that. They can take an ominous, misunderstood, and ambiguous technology like artificial intelligence and boil it down for the consumer in easy to understand terms. And that's what Apple really does best.
So that's how we see it. There's obviously, it's not without downside, and so we approach it very thoughtfully.
Sure.
And as you heard,
He says that we're doing things more thoughtfully than the competitors. In Apple's terms, this means that they're taking what competitors have done, they're refining it, making it a little bit better, and then distributing it to their millions of customers. That's thoughtful. That's what Apple does best. They don't invent new things. They just take ideas from other people, they refine them and improve them and polish them, and then distribute them.
We have always been focused on privacy. And so privacy is a very key tenet of our thrust into AI.
Right. It's been interesting to watch Apple's arc with AI, because I made a whole piece not more than about a year ago about how Apple seems to never say AI, even though they have all these neural engines and machine learning and things like that.
Yeah.
And so now we have almost this pivot where now we're just saying it. We're actually branding it Apple Intelligence now. I'm curious why that change now.
Well, in the beginning and throughout almost everything that we always do, we always talk about the benefit to the user. Mm-hmm. And so the benefit to the user is crash detection and fall detection, not the technology behind the feature.
Sure.
Apple understands that customers want to know what will affect them directly, not all the intricacies of the technology behind it. They just want to know what's going to affect them.
And so we still view it like that, but it became clear that people wanted to know our views on generative AI in particular.
Yeah.
And so we decided to embrace it and called it Apple Intelligence.
Okay. About AI, if it can be used for nefarious things, we won't go down that road.
Yeah.
And at the time, I assumed that meant generative AI was off the table because of all the things that we'd seen about what it was potentially capable of or things that it might do. Has that changed? Is that something that was off the table and you figure now you've got the right tools or the right restrictions to make sure that all goes super well? How do you think about that?
Generative AI was never off the table.
Okay.
It was always about pursuing it in a thoughtful kind of way. And so that's what we've done, and we've implemented it in ways that are less likely to create issues.
I think Tim Cook's giving a subtle jab at Google. We know that Google felt a lot of pressure to rush out their Gemini AI generator. And the image generator generated a lot of crazy images, historical images of black Nazis and things that didn't even make sense. It was embarrassing for Google. They had to retract it from the market and pull it off, and they're revising it and working on it. But I think Tim Cook is trying not to make the same mistake. They've, of course, looked at what Google did, rushing out with a product before it was really ready and rigorously tested, and Apple's taking a more conservative approach. And this is, again, what Apple does. They're never first to anything. They never really invent anything. They just do things that already exist a bit better than everyone else.
How so?
How so? Well, things that, if you think about the kinds of things that we talked about personal context, and we talked about privacy. And so we're not waiting for a comprehensive privacy legislation, regulation to come into effect. We already view privacy as a fundamental human right, and so that's the lens that we see it at. And given that we're doing those things, personal context and privacy, we wanted to integrate it at a deep level, so you're not having to think, oh, well, now I want to do something that uses intelligence. We put it in the apps that you're already using and integrated it deeply.
They've deeply integrated Apple Intelligence and privacy. Now, of course, he's talking to a tech reviewer here, and he's talking to customers of Apple, potential customers of Apple. He's selling this as a benefit because it's privacy, right? But there also is another aspect to this. Apple says repeatedly, Tim Cook has said repeatedly in the presentation and here again, that they are deeply tied together. Privacy and Apple Intelligence are tied together, meaning that if you break them up, that you no longer have the privacy that's integrated with Apple Intelligence. I believe that the second and hidden meaning of this privacy is to defend Apple from onerous regulation, from potentially breaking up their ecosystem. I've said before repeatedly that the entire moat of Apple is the ecosystem. In the case of Apple, the moat and the ecosystem are synonymous. They go hand in hand. If you break up the moat, if you break up all the apps, if you make it so the device doesn't run with its core integrated software, then it's basically just like a commodity. It's a hardware seller. So the integration and the ecosystem go hand in hand. And what Tim Cook's doing here is tying the ecosystem and the deep integration to privacy. That way, if the regulators say, Apple is a monopoly and we need to break up Apple, we need to separate all of these applications from all of these integrations, and we need to untie things, Tim Cook and Apple will then say, well, you can do that. You can break the integration from all of our apps and force us to break everything out into different segments. But if you do that, we can no longer ensure the privacy of our customers. Instead, they'll be sending data to all sorts of various third-party applications, of which we'll have no control over the privacy. So he is forcing regulators to make a choice. Either they let Apple continue with their deeply integrated ecosystem / moat, or they break up the moat and ecosystem and sacrifice customers' privacy. So the genius of this huge, intense focus on privacy from Apple is it serves two major purposes. It's not only desirable for customers, they want privacy on their devices, but it also defends them against regulation. I think this is one of the best moves that Apple has done, because one of the primary concerns I've had for Apple is regulation and having their ecosystem broken up. So I really, really like the direction Apple's going. I actually think it's just so smart. It's so smart, the hidden things they're doing with their company.
Yeah, I think also now there's a lot of talk about it now that there is generative AI.
Yeah.
A lot of people Apple's notorious for never sending anything to the cloud. Everything's on device because that is the most secure way to do it, and was applauded for it. Interestingly, this is a little bit different now. With a lot of these larger models, more complex requests, you actually do have to go off of device. So you've developed, I want to get the name right, private cloud compute. Explain this to us, because I think the general chatter online is, well, they have to be sending data to OpenAI, for example, to get a request back from ChatGPT.
Well, there's private cloud compute, and then there's the arrangement with OpenAI. These two things are different.
Okay.
Distinguishing those two things is really important. And this next part of this, I think they're going to go into where I think Apple's making their next big move. And this is another somewhat hidden move that Apple's making.
And so if you look at private cloud compute, we're utilizing the same silicon, or not the same silicon, but the same basic architecture as the silicon that's in that's in the iPhone
15, yeah.
And we're using the same software. And so we believe that we've done it in such a way that it's as safe and secure and private in the private cloud compute as the device. And so we really worked on this a lot and put a lot of wood behind that arrow to assure that. If you're working on something that requires world knowledge, so you're out of the domain of personal context and so forth, then you may want to go and use one of the large language models that are on the market. And we selected what we feel is the best one.
So that's the distinction, and I think that was really smart by Apple. It would have been nice to have OpenAI deeply integrated into the ecosystem and a part of Apple, but then that brings in the huge question, do you really want OpenAI to have all of your data and know everything about your contacts and your photos? Most people would say no. Most people would say, I don't really trust Sam Altman, someone that came on the scene just a couple of years ago, with that level of data. So they're not doing that. They have Apple Intelligence, which is deeply secure and private from what he's saying here. It's just as private as your phone. And that's what has knowledge about your context, about your messages, your photos, and all that stuff. And then you have the option to go outside of your context and hand off questions to OpenAI. And that's a completely different thing than Apple Intelligence.
With OpenAI and ChatGPT, but you'll make a conscious decision to do that.
Every time.
Every time.
So you can guarantee that there will never be any data sent to OpenAI without your explicit user permission.
That's right.
So we know that Apple Intelligence knows your personal context, your photos, your messages, and all of that. That's Apple Intelligence. And then the handoff to OpenAI is entirely different. That's for things outside of the world. That's things where you're answering different questions and you have a nice little warning that you're going to OpenAI with those queries. So those are two distinct things. Now, Apple stresses, and Tim Cook stresses in this interview, the privacy aspect. This is going to be really private, and it's just going to be a nice relationship with OpenAI where they can answer some of your questions in a seamless way without registering an account. So that's nice from Apple, but I think there's an entirely different aspect to this. This is a new default position for Apple. Think about this for a minute. OpenAI is the defaulted LLM. It's the defaulted position to be the default handoff when you have these questions that are for LLMs. Now, they mentioned in the presentation that they're open to having different LLMs. At some point, they might have 4 or 5 to pick from, but there's going to be a ranking order. If you have OpenAI and Perplexity and Gemini and then this other LLM and this other one, which gets to be defaulted? How is Apple going to pick the default LLM? Well, I think it's going to be financially driven. I think in large part, it'll be financially driven. We already know the potential value of defaults. The value of being the default search engine in Safari is $20 billion per year, according to Google. Google's willing to write this big of a check every single year that grows every single year. It's probably closer to $25 billion in 2024. And they're willing to do so because they see the value in defaults. And Apple just created a new default position. Instead of with search, it's with LLM. So now Apple has 2 default positions, the one with their Safari search engine that Google currently owns, and the one with LLMs that OpenAI currently owns. What is the one with OpenAI worth? Potentially worth? I don't know. I can't say, but I think it's got to be worth something. Just looking at these numbers and that the default search engine is worth $20 billion, I have to imagine that being the default LLM and the data and exposure and different flow you get of data from that is worth something. Whether it's $100 million or $1 billion or $5 billion, I can't say. But I think that Apple just created a new default position, which could be highly lucrative. Based on other default positions and what companies are willing to pay for that flow and that data and that partnership, I think this could be another highly lucrative one. So they're starting off with OpenAI, but they could eventually have a bidding war. They could have other companies bid to be the default LLM handoff with Apple. So this is another, I think, somewhat sneaky thing that Apple's doing. Again, they have the privacy aspect of this. If you don't want to use an LM, you don't have to. You can just use Apple Intelligence, which knows all your context and personal stuff. But they have this new potential moneymaker with another default position to be that LLM. So Apple is finding new ways to grow through their massive distribution. So again, when I study this presentation overall and I view how it impacts Apple and the hidden things they're doing behind the scenes, I can see that there's a lot of thought going behind this. They are really combating regulation, tying privacy to their ecosystem, and they're finding new ways to generate money through both incentivizing upgrades of their devices, where only 5% of users right now have access to Apple Intelligence. They're going to get the other 95% to upgrade. And then they also have the default position that they created with the LLM, which, as we've seen from Google, can be highly lucrative. So Apple's covering a lot of different things with one presentation, and I just thought it was impressive. I thought they did a really good job. Now, I want to talk about my history with Apple stock because I've bought a lot of this stock and I've recently trimmed some of this stock. I want to go through and kind of give some context here. Apple's a position I've held since early 2018. It's one of the OGs in my portfolio, and I've overall done a lot of buys and a few trims. But right now, the position is a total of $47,392, and $30,580 of that is gains. So right now, the majority of the position is gains. I first started buying it in 2018, but it was only with a small amount of money. My portfolio was small overall. Apple was just one of the many positions, But it was 2020 during the COVID pandemic when I really decided to jump into Apple. I sold $20,000 worth of bonds and I bought a lot of Apple in 2020. This was at around $90 per share. So I bought $20,000 at $90 per share. And then I continued to hold. Apple traded up a little bit. And then in April 30th of 2021, Apple had a big dip. During that dip, I decided to buy more of it, especially in June of 2021. That's when it traded down to around 120. So I increased my position about double at that time period. These two large buys of $20,000 here and $20,000 here are really what grew my Apple position. So that's what made it into a big position, hugely in the green. Now, I've done some trims along the way. Some of them have been good and some of them have been poor. One of the trims I did recently was a poor trim. I trimmed it at 180. So I trimmed it just before this big 20% run up. That was a bad move. I should have held on to it. I was getting a little bit concerned about how aggressive the EU regulations were with Apple. The valuation had gone up to around a 30 PE. The EU was being incredibly aggressive with their regulations, and I decided to take a little bit off the table. Apple has maneuvered, I think, really well since then, and the stock has moved up to well above $200 per share. So over this time period, I've done a couple really good buys, and I've also added to it at different times that I think were good. And then I've done a couple trims that I think were decent and one trim that I think was bad. I wish I could undo that trim if I could. That's my trading history with Apple. If we look at it overall, I have $29,500 of gains, that's market gains, and another $1,032 in dividends earned. So that's the combined gains of my Apple position. And this is in the passive income portfolio. There's another portfolio where I've held Apple for a couple years, and I've sold out of the entire holding. That's in the story fund. So this is a different portfolio. It's only worth $230,000. Around $70,000 of that is gains. Now, if we look at the story fund, I don't hold Apple in it currently because I recently sold out of the position, but I want to show you this sell. This is the trade I did with Apple in the story fund. December 11th, 2023, I sold Apple and bought Netflix. So that was December of last year, and I sold Apple at a price of $193. So that seems like a bad sell because Apple went up after selling it, but we also have to pay attention to what I bought. I bought $2,500 of Netflix at the same time. Netflix's stock price at the time of this trade was $464. And if we go back to that day, Netflix is up 42% since that day. So Netflix has gone up a lot more than Apple during that trade. So overall, Apple's been a position that I've never sold for less than I've bought it. Every single buy I've done at the company has been accretive. I've made money on all of them. Now, there's been some trims that have been really good, where they've been accretive to my performance, and some trims where I trimmed it too low or I trimmed it too early, and it's been detrimental to my performance. But overall, given the entire track record here, this has been a big winning position that's outperformed the markets. Now that's going to be it for now. If you want to see additional content, exclusive episodes, and have access to qualtrim.com, you can check out the Patreon in the link in the description below. Other than that, I'll see you next time.